Introduction and the opportunity to talk to you guys today about depression and Parkinson's disease from foggy Ottawa. Okay, so my lab is generally involving animal models of Parkinson's and depression. I do a little bit of work with clinicians on human factors as well. So today I'll be talking first a little bit about Parkinson's with regards to background factors that could be involved. Then I'll switch gears and talk a little bit about treatment type things towards the end. But first, as you can just see, Parkinson's disease, the majority of cases of Parkinson's disease are said to be idiopathic or of unknown origins. But what we do know is that certainly there's a combination of environmental and genetic factors that probably together combine to provoke the manifestation of the disease. Among these, as you can see here, my lab is particularly interested in inflammatory immune system and how factors in that relate to inflammation could be important for Parkinson's. But these same factors we find are also might be important for depression. So if you look at this first slide, some of the risk, the environmental, obviously there's genetics, as you can see here on the left. There's various genetic mutations that LRRK2 and various other ones that people are exploring. But besides the genetics, there's obvious environmental factors, and these include immune, viral, bacterial agents that might play a role in the disease, even psychological stress, as well as heavy metals that are found out in the environment, and pesticides. Paraquat, rotenone, for example, are pesticides that are still used, and we use them in the lab to model Parkinson's syndrome. So these factors collectively is thought to provoke the onset of Parkinson's. And if you see the next factor, if you see the next slide here, some of the same factors are involved in depression. Immune agents, stress, and genetic factors, these top three factors, have all been implicated in depression as well as Parkinson's disease. Of course, depression is not the same as Parkinson's disease. It has other issues such as one's personality variables, one's social support structure, coping, and all these other things also play a role in whether you get depression. But there are certain commonalities between depression and Parkinson's disease in terms of the mechanisms. And we know that depression itself can influence some of the motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease, as well as reduce the overall quality of life. So my lab and other labs are interested in looking at using what's referred to as a multi-hit model to explain both Parkinson's and depression, that the initial hit might be some genetic vulnerability and some perhaps in utero or developmental stressors that could affect the organism while you're developing still in the womb and during early life. And then through early life adolescence into late adulthood, my lab and others are interested in how environmental toxicants, heavy metals, pesticides, together with psychological stressors and immune stressors such as viruses and bacteria, collectively could impinge upon the brain and the body overall and make one vulnerable to not just one disease, but multiple diseases. And certainly with regards to Parkinson's, we know that one of the most common comorbid features or co-occurring illness is depression. It's very common. About 40 to 50% of Parkinson patients have depression. So these are some of the environmental and genetic factors that we think collectively cause the emergence of both Parkinson's and depression. And we know that both diseases, Parkinson's and depression, are also very heterogeneous diseases. They have certain different symptoms manifest at different times and in different intensities in different individuals. So of course, if we just first turn to Parkinson's disease, the core symptoms of Parkinson's, of course, are the motor symptoms, the muscle rigidity, tremor, postural instability, slowness of movement that we call bradykinesia. And it's thought that these are largely stemming from the degeneration of course, the dopamine neurons, which are found in a part of the midbrain called the substantia nigra. So we have the degeneration of these dopamine neurons. And at the same time, we have these what are called Lewy bodies, or these basically abnormal clumps of protein that occur in the Parkinsonian brain. So these are some of the hallmark features that we find when we look in the post-mortem Parkinson brain that we think can explain some of these motor disturbances. And the same thing when we look at animal models, when we inject animals with pesticides and things like this that are implicated in Parkinson's, we see similar behavioral and similar pathology within the brains of animals, rodents, and even non-human primates. But Parkinson's is more than just motor symptoms. There are other symptoms as well, non-motor symptoms, including olfactory problems, so problems with smell that often occur in Parkinson's. Of course, this also occurs in Alzheimer's disease. Gastrointestinal dysfunction, so irritable stomach problems and things like this are common. Fatigue, sleep disturbances. A subset of Parkinson patients also will develop some cognitive symptoms or problems with certain types of memory tasks. But of course, for interest today is the anxiety and the depression that are probably the most common comorbid non-motor symptoms that we see in the Parkinsonian brain. So the world famous neurologist Brack has put forward various stages to characterize the different stages or development of Parkinson's disease, ranging from Brack stages 1 and 2, you can see here on the left, Brack stages 3 and 4 in the middle, and Brack stages 5 and 6 on the right-hand side here. These three sort of cross-sectional side view of a human brain in a cartoon form. And you can see the areas that are shaded dark, reddish, or brownish indicate the different brain areas that are affected during the different stages of the typical Parkinson disease. And you can see on the left here on the Brack stages 1 and 2 on the early, oh my goodness, sorry about that. On the early stages, Brack stages 1 and 2 early stages, you can see that the bottom part of the brain, referred to as the brainstem, looks dark here and is affected very early on. Whereas in the middle brain here, you can see the dark, it moves towards the other parts of the brain. And then later on the far right here, the Brack stages 5 and 6, the most later stages or serious stages of the disease, it moves throughout the brain, the pathology, where you get neuronal damage and you get those pathological Lewy body clumps of abnormal tissue, basically. But the interesting part with regards to depression is the stage 1 and 2 here on the left. The early pathology that begins in the brainstem actually is important for depression, because within the brainstem, there are the two main cell body areas that are important for the production of serotonin and norepinephrine throughout the brain. So although Parkinson's disease is characterized by the degeneration of the dopamine system, which is important for the motor functioning, what is not talked about so much is that you also get damage and degeneration to a certain degree of the serotonin and dopamine systems within Parkinson's as well. And damage to those systems occurs early or before the damage to the dopamine motor system, which is not seen until the later Brack stages, stages 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So those early stages 1 and 2, you get some of the olfactory problems, autonomic problems, and you get some of the depression early on before the motor symptoms. So the depression occurs probably before the motor symptoms. So it's not just simply a reaction to getting that disability because of the motor system is knocked offline, basically. So we think it could be related to actually pathology that begins before the motor system, and so you get the degeneration of these norepinephrine cell body groups and these serotonin cell body groups, which are actually in the brainstem. So that's a very important fact. Also, and so this next slide here actually sort of illustrates that. The top, there's two parts to this figure, the top part and the bottom part. The top part is the locus, shows the loss of locus coeruleus norepinephrine containing neurons within the brainstem. And the bottom part of this figure shows the loss of the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra that occurs a little later on. So what you get here, if you look at the top first, this is the number of locus coerulean neurons. So you can see there are 3 squares there. The square on the left are the control or healthy age-matched subjects. The ones in the middle are patients that died of Alzheimer's disease, and the ones on the far right are those that died from Parkinson's. So you can see there's a reduction in the number of locus coeruleus norepinephrine neurons, both in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, compared to the control. And you can see on the bottom, again, the controls on the far left, the Alzheimer's in the middle, and the Parkinson's is on the right. This is the number of dopamine substantia nigra neurons. You can see here that the Alzheimer patients are the same as the control, so they do not lose those substantia nigra neurons, but the Parkinsonian patients do. But the interesting part is the top figure, which suggests that there is a loss of norepinephrine-containing neurons both in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but it's greater in Parkinson's than Alzheimer. And this correlates with the incidence of depression in these diseases as well, because typically depression is more common in Parkinson's than Alzheimer's, but yet there is still a greater number of incidents of depression in Alzheimer's than the control population. But what these figures are showing and reinforcing is from the other slide that the the norepinephrine neurons and the serotonin neurons also degenerate. It's not just the dopamine neurons, and this could be important, and they degenerate before the dopamine neurons, which could be important for the why we see the depression at a large degree in Parkinson's patients. So this next slide here is again showing the progression of Parkinson's symptomology. So this is showing those alpha-synuclein aggregations, basically those pathological aggregations. Most neurological conditions have some sort of pathological aggregates in the brain. Alzheimer's have pathological aggregates that are referred to as senile plaques. In Parkinson's, they're referred to as Lewy bodies. And so what this graph is showing, that you actually get these Lewy body aggregations in even outside the brain. You get Lewy body aggregations in the adrenal gland, as well as in the intestine that's shown here, and you get them in the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb, of course, which is important for smell. So, and smell is, problems with smell occur early on in the disease before motor functioning. So this could be related to these alpha-synuclein aggregations. You also get them in the intestine, which could be important for the gastrointestinal problems I mentioned about. And you get them in the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is important for anxiety. The adrenal gland releases stress hormones that are important for that. So this pathology is occurring in not only in different parts of the brain outside the motor area, but also even outside the brain itself and other parts of the body. So, and this slide is showing basically a normal timeline for neuronal degeneration as a function of development, basically. So this graph is broken up into 3 different chunks. If you look at the bottom of the figure here, there's normal aging on the left, prodromal phase in the middle, and clinical phase on the right. So then, and you see this red line, which is basic neuronal density, reducing as you go from normal aging to clinical phase. So we think Parkinson's disease is essentially a threshold disease, and that by the time you get to the neurologist to get diagnosis, you've probably lost close to 80% of your dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra. So what this tells us is that those dopamine neurons in the midbrain substantia nigra have a very high degree of redundancy or compensatory responses within them. What that means is they're very plastic, and there's a built-in mechanism to protect the body and brain against loss to a certain degree, causing motor disturbances. So that means that you can lose quite a few of those before you start to show motor symptoms. You can lose quite a few, and you need to pass some sort of a threshold, which we think is around 50, 60, 70%, before you actually start to show motor symptoms. What this also tells us is there's probably a lengthy prodromal phase, or phase where you're not showing motor clinical symptoms yet, but the disease is slowly progressing. But this could give us hope too, because this means there's a long prodromal period where if we could identify people that are going to get Parkinson's in the future, we could probably develop some sort of treatment to slow down or stop this process. Because again, if you look at the normal red line as it declines across these 3 different developmental stages, if you look at the normal aging, that's a normal individual that does not get Parkinson's disease, will not get Parkinson's disease, but they're still showing a loss in the number of dopamine neurons over time. This is just normal aging. That's why there's these built-in compensatory mechanisms, such that you have to lose a lot of dopamine neurons before you start to show symptomology. So you lose some just to normal aging. Once you pass from normal aging, though, however, into that next box there, prodromal, that's the individuals that are likely or going to eventually develop Parkinson's disease, assuming they live long enough to actually develop that Parkinsonian state. So interestingly, it's within this prodromal middle state, as you can see here, that early symptoms in that stage 1 BROC, where you get the degeneration in the the brainstem starting, the norepinephrine, serotonin neurons are being affected, the gastrointestinal, the corticoid stress responses in the periphery, all those regions are being affected. And it's during those prodromal stages that individuals start to show the smell disturbances and autonomic disturbances, gut things like this, gut problems, and the depression and anxiety start. The depression and anxiety typically start during this phase at least 4, 5, 6, maybe even 8 or 9 or 10 years before they actually move on into the final phase, the clinical phase. And it's at this clinical phase where it says PD diagnosis. At that point, it's thought that that's when individuals have passed that threshold and have lost the 50, 60, 70, or maybe even 80% of those midbrain dopamine neurons, and they're actually showing the motor symptoms that are characteristic of Parkinson's. So the prodromal phase and this idea suggests that there's a long stage there where the disease is progressing, but you're not yet showing motor symptoms, but you're starting to show these other prodromal markers. So this prodromal, so it's very difficult to treat neurological conditions by the time you reach the final clinical stage, because you've already lost so many neurons. So this prodromal stage, a lot of researchers now are looking at potential biomarkers or ways we can intervene during that prodromal stage to stop the eventual spread to full-blown disease. So as I mentioned, depression is one of the most common comorbid symptoms or co-occurring conditions that occur with Parkinson's. Of course, it's not just Parkinson's, it's also found in multiple sclerosis as a comorbid and Alzheimer's, but it seems to be slightly more common in Parkinson's as a comorbid feature than these other diseases. In fact, this 40 to 50%, some people think this might be underestimated. Another factor is depression and Parkinson's sometimes have overlapping symptoms, and the depression itself can cause what we call psychomotor retardation, or a general fatigue and slowing down. So sometimes the depressive symptoms in a Parkinson patient will go undetected because it'll be thought that they're just parts of the primary motor diagnosis. But so these rates might even be underestimates. So yeah, so quite a number of studies have been done to look at this idea of comorbid depression with Parkinson's, and that, I mean, the most obvious thing when you hear about a person with Parkinson's getting depression, the most obvious thing you would say was, of course they're depressed. I mean, everybody knows it's a progressive disease, and it causes disability, which can result in loss of social interactions, can result in retiring early from a job, can result in loss of productivity and various other things. In a way, it's the question almost should be, whoever doesn't get depressed is actually a fairly resilient person with a very strong coping skills. As of course Michael J. Fox is of course a very good representation of somebody who doesn't get depressed and is very highly resilient. But a number of studies have done and suggest that retrospective studies have suggested that, where you basically look back in time, and in most of those studies have shown that, as I mentioned earlier, the depression likely occurs before the person even has a motor symptoms, or before the person even has a Parkinsonian diagnosis. Hence, it's obviously not just the stress of having this disease or knowing the progressive prognosis that's causing the depression, but we think it's other physiological effects. And a lot of these people are looking at including things like inflammation, as I mentioned earlier, that we look at, and the fact that these areas like the norepinephrine and serotonin neurons also degenerate. So this 2004 study I cite here showed that future PD patients have about a 2.4 times elevated risk of developing depression. So if an individual basically, and then similarly, people with depression tend to be predisposed for Parkinson's. So the relationship is bidirectional both ways. So essentially, all that means is that if an individual is eventually going to develop Parkinson's disease, they have a much greater likelihood of being depressed before they even get the diagnosis than an individual in the general population. So again, just to show that probably some of the early pathological stages of Parkinson's are increasing the risk of getting depression as well as Parkinson's itself. Of course, the typical symptoms of depression, we talked about Parkinson's symptoms, the motor symptoms, the depression, prolonged sadness. This is sometimes referred to as melancholia, lack of interest in normal daily activities, or not finding activities pleasurable that were previously found to be pleasurable, so watching movies, playing a musical instrument, going out socially, these things, you lose interest in these things. This is referred to as anhedonia, and we can actually model that to a certain degree in rodents and non-primates, although we can't model the sadness. Other issues: irritability, difficulty concentrating. These are what we call as affective or mood symptoms. There are also depression has what are referred to as somatic or more physical symptoms rather than actual mood symptoms or affective symptoms. And some of these somatic or physical symptoms, including changes in appetite or sleep. So individuals depressed typically either lose weight or gain weight. More often than not, they tend to lose weight, but some gain weight because they selectively tend to crave carbohydrates in particular. Sleep changes as well, hypersomnia or hyposomnia, so sleeping more or sleeping less. Of course, sometimes it's hard to disentangle this from the actual primary Parkinsonian motor aspects of this, because just Parkinson's itself, even in a non-depressed Parkinson patient, they often obviously have problems with sleep as well. And this can lead to the next symptom of lack of energy and fatigue, general aches and pains as well. Like some of these physical symptoms, like I said, you see them in depressed patients that are non-Parkinsonian, but you also see them in Parkinsonian patients that are non-depressed. So sometimes it's difficult to disentangle what's causing what, whether these symptoms are related to the actual depression or related to the Parkinson's disease. This makes the whole idea of disentangling the different comorbidities difficult. Of course, beside these symptoms, other symptoms that physicians, I guess, need to be especially wary of are suicidal thoughts. Depression, of course, is one of the most common reasons for suicide, so that needs to be monitored. There are now fast-acting antidepressant drugs like ketamine that can actually get rid of these suicidal thoughts very quickly, so that's a very important thing to look at. Drugs, there's evidence that some of the Parkinsonian drugs could potentially cause depression itself. Interactions of different drugs that the patient may be on could also be important in causing the depression. That should be looked at. Comorbid states, diabetes, and other conditions that cause fluctuations in hormones in the body, thyroidal problems as well, can also cause depression. So all these things need to be screened out as well. As I just mentioned, there are overlapping features between depression and Parkinson's that make it difficult to disentangle what is related to what. So you can see here, of course, Parkinson's can cause the bradykinesia, stoop posture, mask face, tremor, etc. But the major depression somatic symptoms or physical symptoms also can cause psychomotor retardation, agitation, stoop posture. So again, it's difficult to figure out what's what. Decreased energy, fatigue, these are all common symptoms that are found both in depression and Parkinson's, and one could possibly make the other more obvious. I know my own interactions with the many wonderful people in the Parkinson community. I've noticed during times of stress, sometimes when I've known a person who has Parkinson's, when they're stressed, having to give a presentation or something, for example, I'll anecdotally notice that their tremor might get worse. So you can see the stress and anxiety from the depression itself can sometimes worsen some of the Parkinsonian symptoms. But beside all these things, other risk factors that are important for depression in the general population also apply for the Parkinsonian cases of depression. And these risk factors include, excessive stress or history. People that have a lot of different stresses through their life are more likely to get depression, whether they're Parkinsonian or not. Personality variables, type A anxious people sometimes are more likely to get depression. Sex, females tend to be more likely to get depression. Personal family history of depression, just like, although Parkinson's is idiopathic many cases, and that it's not strictly genes, there are obviously familial forms of Parkinson that are strictly caused by genetics, and even the idiopathic strictly genetic forms also, we think, have genetic risk factors and comorbid illnesses as well. So the general stress that's associated with depression and Parkinson's is associated with the quality of life. So the stress, like I said, just mentioned, the stress and the depression itself might make the motor symptoms worse, but beside that, it's associated with a poorer quality of life. And in fact, anecdotally, again, I've heard people say that the worst part of their illness sometimes is actually the depression. This can impact treatment adherence. Depressed individuals are less likely to keep taking their medications on a regular basis. They tend to say, why should they tend to have a certain degree of hopelessness, and are less likely to strictly adhere to treatment regimens. And of course, the stress could be causing this through many mechanisms. This little circle chart here shows that stress can affect neurotransmitters through the brain, can increase glucocorticoids, stress hormones, can cause reductions in trophic factors. Trophic factors, that's just a fancy term for growth proteins that stimulate the growth and normal health of neurons. Stress can reduce some of these, making neurons less healthy. Inflammatory mediators. Stress can cause an increase in inflammation in the brain, which is very unhealthy for neurons, for both, and has been linked to both depression and Parkinson's. And this is a major feature of my research that I'll touch upon shortly. We've already talked about what this slide says. Basically, depression is often evident long before the first motor symptoms because of the pathology probably starts outside the motor system. Relationship is likely bidirectional between the depression and the Parkinson's. Like I said, there may be common mechanisms to both these conditions with respect to inflammation and some of these stress factors, and one illness could affect the severity of the other. So when you look, this is again probably a little bit of a review. You can see here on the left the dark region that says in the brain that says normal and PD. These are the substantia nigra neurons. They get the name nigra because they're darkly pigmented. You can see here in the PD patient, Parkinson patient, there are less of these dopamine substantia nigra neurons. But as I mentioned earlier, the subserotonin neurons and the dopamine neurons are also lost early on. Loss of the dopamine neurons itself can also affect these other serotonin these other neurochemical systems. The serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine systems, they all talk to one another. So if you knock one offline, basically the others will be affected in some regard. Even if they don't degenerate, they'll still be affected. And interestingly, depression can present at any stage of Parkinson's, at the disease. Although I said it's often evident early on, in some cases it might actually occur later on. But what is clear is it doesn't follow the actual progressive degeneration. So there's not a correlation between the degree of degeneration and the amount of depression. Again, suggesting that the actual motor symptoms and the actual motor pathology itself is not driving the depression itself. Also, you can see here from this little cartoon of this side profile of a brain on the bottom left, the stimulation using deep brain stimulation, STN stands for subthalamic nucleus. Stimulation of the subthalamic nucleus itself can affect the depressive symptoms. And in some individuals, the deep brain stimulation, when it gets rid of the motor symptoms, it can also get rid of the depression symptoms. But in other individuals, it doesn't. So again, it's a complex interaction for sure. Imaging studies have found widespread differences in the functional connectivity of the norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin systems. As I mentioned earlier, one system can interact with another, and there's no simple there's not one system that's causing all the disease, but rather, like I said, an accumulation of various connections. So the neurotransmitter changes themselves that are linked to depression. Beside that, as I mentioned, other things could be important in the depressive comorbidity. And one of the things that we're studying in my lab and other labs is the inflammation, and that actual inflammation in the brain. We know inflammation in the brain is important for the development of Parkinson's disease, but it also appears to be important for the development of depression. So this might be one common mechanism for both disease states. We found, so in fact, I remember about 15 or 20 years ago when I first started to look at inflammation in Parkinson's disease, the general community didn't really accept it. And I remember speaking to neurologists and they thought that neuroinflammation in the immune system had no relation with regards to Parkinson's. But it's gone from being this marginal system that's probably thought to not be involved to being a mainstream player in Parkinson's disease, such that some even consider this the third biological hallmark of Parkinson's. The first two being the loss of those dopamine neurons, and the second being those Lewy bodies. So inflammation definitely occurs in the brains of Parkinson patients. We know from postmortem analysis that we find, for example, an activation of the microglial cells, which are the special immune cells within the brain. These are highly activated in the Parkinson brain. And then there's been some evidence that anti-inflammatory treatments might actually have beneficial effects for Parkinson's, at least in animal studies. Clinical trials, not so much. There were a few clinical trials done with anti-inflammatories that didn't really work well in Parkinson patients, but it's thought that could be because the patients were caught at a late stage, and if they were caught early on, perhaps these anti-inflammatories might have a more beneficial effect. Also, the anti-inflammatories were generally very general over-the-counter drugs, a lot of them, like ibuprofen and things like this, and they might not be actually robust enough or strong enough to actually do the job. And plus they might get rid of beneficial parts of the immune system and not just the damaging inflammatory parts. So more targeted, specific anti-inflammatories might be warranted. So in addition to Parkinson's, inflammation is also important in depression. We found elevated levels of pro-inflammatory factors both in the blood and the CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid, of depressed patients. Animal models of depression where we stress out animals, rodents or non-human primates, and look at their brains, we find some of these same pro-inflammatory changes occur, although less strong or robust as you would find in a Parkinson brain, but they're still there. And there's evidence that traditional antidepressants, like your SSRIs, your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like Prozac and the like, might actually reverse some of these inflammatory changes. So when we talk about inflammation and its importance for Parkinson's and depression, and perhaps their comorbidity, one cell within the brain takes precedence, and that's the microglial cell that I just mentioned before. So the neuron is the primary signaling cell in the brain, of course, that's affected, the norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine signaling neurons being affected in Parkinson's and giving rise to the symptomology. But there's another cell type within the brain, a non-neuronal cell type, and this are glia. And out of the glia, there's a few different types. Of the glia, there's the subtype called microglia, because of their size, they're micro, are the immune cells in the brain that are important for the inflammatory processes that occur in Parkinson's and depression. So the microglia are the first responders to any environmental perturbation or stressor that gets into the brain. So, for example, we talked earlier about the environment and pesticides, heavy metals, viral or bacterial challenges, and how those could get into the brain and potentially kill dopamine neurons or other neurons, serotonin, norepinephrine. So one of the ways in which they might kill them is by overactivating microglial cells. These microglial cells, their job is to detect things that get in and try to neutralize these things. So they're actually trying to help get rid of these things. But what we think might be happening is microglia get excessively turned on, such that even when those environmental events have been gotten rid of, are no longer in the brain, the microglia are still in an activated state. And as you can see here, these microglial cells actually change their shape from this spindly spider-like to this clumped up state. And when they're in this clumped up state, their normal role is to get rid of junk in the brain, as well as release things like free radicals that you've probably heard of. And these free radicals are one of the mechanisms which microglia get rid of viruses and bacteria that get into the brain. But we think that even when it's gotten rid of any virus or bacteria got in there, they're still spilling out these free radicals. And these free radicals cause oxidative stress on adjacent neurons, especially dopamine neurons. Dopamine neurons are highly vulnerable to oxidative stress. So I don't really have time to go into much more detail, but all this to say that these microglial cells become hyperactivated, and they, from these environmental events, and they might be, and this might be one mechanism that's killing dopamine neurons and possibly killing norepinephrine serotonin neurons, causing Parkinson's itself, as well as the comorbidity. Here's an actual slide from my lab. This is actually a brain section from a rat, and you can see the this is a cross section through a rat brain, and on the left is the control side, and on the right is a side that was injected with one of these environmental insults, toxins, that was related to Parkinson's disease. The green are the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra. You can see them there, and the red are the microglial cells. So you can see on the injected side, there's a lot more of these hyperactivated microglial cells, and they're releasing oxidative stressors. And eventually, these oxidative stressors will kill those dopamine neurons. So these next two slides are very complicated, and I will just broad strokes go through them. So when these microglial cells, as you can see here, are hyperactivated, they can release oxidative stressors that can kill the dopamine neurons, which is important for Parkinson's, but they are also important for depression. And one of the ways they're important for depression is these microglial cells release factors called cytokines. These are pro-inflammatory signaling molecules, like immunotransmitter signaling molecules, just like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine are neurotransmitter signaling molecules. These are immunotransmitter signaling molecules. When those microglial cells release these cytokines can stimulate what's referred to as the stress axis. And I don't have time to go into all the details, but it can stimulate the release of hormones and causes changes in neuronal plasticity within the brain regions like the hippocampus. And these changes are highly aligned with depression. Other things these cytokines can do, again, this is a very complicated slide, and I don't expect you to very quickly grab everything, but this slide is the bottom line is what this slide is showing is these cytokines can also cause changes in neurotransmitters, and these cytokines can interact with stress additively or synergistically to augment the neurotransmitter changes. So as I mentioned earlier, the degeneration of these neurotransmitter systems can give rise to the depression, the norepinephrine, serotonin, but even the neurons that are not degenerating, they can still be adversely affected by these stresses, as well as these cytokines that are released from the microglial cells. So there's different mechanisms here in which for example, the neuroinflammatory microglial cell can give rise to depression, as well as Parkinson's disease, by perturbing all these different systems, the stress hormones, the neurotransmitters, interacting with stressors to augment the effect of stressors. So the inflammatory microglia can give rise to both the Parkinson's and the depression. So we think that they might be a common target that we might be able to target in the future that could have benefit for both aspects, the Parkinson's and the depression. So we think that very highly targeted anti-inflammatory treatments would be useful, again, for not only Parkinson's, but also the comorbid depression. But we would never suggest that anti-inflammatories are the whole story. we see the anti-inflammatories as more of a supportive treatment with whatever other treatments that are being administered with the Parkinson's primary symptoms as well as the comorbidity. So of course, again, bringing it back to the depression, the primary drug types used for depression are the SSRIs, the serotonin acting agonists, the SNRIs, which are selective norepinephrine and serotonin reuptake inhibitors. MAOB, this is the enzyme that breaks down catecholamines, tricyclics, and even dopamine agonists. All these drug types essentially act on serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine within the brain. So what we suggest is possibly giving anti-inflammatory treatments together with these other more traditional antidepressant treatments could be beneficial for both the depression and possibly the Parkinsonian symptoms. The SSRIs are again, that's the fluoxetine, Prozac are the most commonly prescribed. And there's a number of studies that suggest these SSRIs are useful for treating depression, and they're probably just as good in Parkinson's patients for depression than non-Parkinson depressed patients. Here's an example of a study. There are others, and you can see here this study is measuring changes in the HAM-D, which is the Hamilton Depression Scale. So it's measuring the amount of depression over time. So in Parkinson patients that received either placebo, that's the black line, which is just the control, and then the sort of greenish blue and the red lines are for two different antidepressants. One is paroxetine, which is the red, that's an SSRI, and the bluish one is venlafaxine, which is an SNRI. So SNRI affects norepinephrine and serotonin. The red affects just serotonin. And you can see in both cases, the drug treatment is reducing the amount of depression relative to the placebo. So they do tend, all this to say, these medications do work in Parkinsonian depressed patients pretty much as well as they do in non-Parkinsonian depressed patients. However, these medications take a while to work, so this is why we need to look at suicidality, and drugs like ketamine might be better for people that are severely depressed and very suicidal. Ketamine works right away. There is some concern that the SSRIs might aggravate motor symptoms in certain cases, and they could interact with Parkinsonian primary medications. There have been most studies that have looked at this, though, have not found much in the way of interactions, which is good, but there are a few studies that suggest they could interact and cause things like a serotonin syndrome, which is basically sweating and agitation and things like this. But basically, whether they're going to interact or not is sort of a trial and error on the part of the neurologist or psychiatrist. There was some other, this study is showing some adverse side effects of the antidepressants in Parkinson patients. Again, the side effects are relatively mild and very similar to non-Parkinson patients. You can see here in the red bar there, sexual dysfunction and fatigue are two of the side effects that are most prominent from these drugs. But these symptoms, again, are relatively mild and only seen in a subset of Parkinson patients. And finally, because I think we're at about the 45-minute mark, the last two slides just to end with, I think the future for not just Parkinson's disease, but pretty much all diseases and disorders, we're moving to a more precision-based or personalized medicine approach where we consider in a more holistic manner the social support, personality, lifestyle of the individual together with the genetic predisposition. Genetic screening now will find certain patients that have certain mutations, example like the LRRK2, LRRK2, for example, mutation in Parkinson's disease. These patients might show slightly different profiles with regard to medications than other patients. The different comorbidities, like I said, besides Parkinson's, you want to look at other things like, is the person also having anxiety? Is there diabetes on board, autonomic? And you want to perhaps consider tailoring the treatment, although this personalized medication approach obviously requires a lot of technology and probably expense that would make it difficult currently. And this final slide is a little complicated, but you don't need to look at it all. But again, it's just looking at a more personalized approach. Prodromal PD, it'd be useful if we can triage and identify individuals early on before they develop full-blown symptoms, and then tailor the treatments according based on, again, their genetics and the type of symptom profile that the individuals manifest. So it's important to look at not just the motor symptoms, but all the non-motor symptoms and the overall history of the individual. And I thank you for your attention. We're 12:47, right? So right on time. This last slide is basically showing the next Living Well conferences for mental health and Parkinson's, and I urge you all to sign up for that. And I am open for questions right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haley, for such an informative presentation. I've been receiving tons of questions actually throughout your presentation, which is never a bad thing. So hopefully you don't mind being in the hot seat. I have one lady who says, I have been diagnosed for 5 years, now 66, fairly minimal progression, tremor in right hand, increasing fatigue, some depression, not all P related, but for the past 2 years, my main issue has been experiencing issues with mouth movements. My neurologist is not sure for the reason, maybe dyskinesia. I've been on Seroplex for depression since April 2014, about the same time that I've been taking levodopa carcinomate. I'm wondering if there's possibly any depression medications that could be related to mouth movements. Do you know anything about the interaction between the medications for this?
So for depression, there's a medication called Seroquel that's given, and Seroquel is associated with twitches and sometimes mouth movements if given for a long period of time. But what was the medication she was on? I can't remember.
It says Cinemet levodopa, and then the other one was for
and those are for Parkinson. What about the Seroquel? No.
Seroplex, it says.
I'm not really familiar with that one. That's a trade name. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know Seroquel can cause that,
Sure.
but the SSRIs normally wouldn't really cause that type of mouth movements.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Well, the other question, 2 questions, is one, is depression and PD situational, or is it neurochemical change caused by the PD?
That is a great question, and my talk really revolved around that a lot. So the first part about the situational, that essentially means, is it a reaction to the distress of getting PD? And the answer to that is generally no. In a sub portion of people, it could be that. It could be situational in certain individuals. But as I mentioned, many cases, the depression is early before the motor symptoms. So in those cases, no, it's not situational. Now, is it related to the PD underlying pathology? Yes, in some way. Is it related to the degeneration of the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra? No, I don't think so. It is related probably to the degeneration of those brainstem regions, serotonin and norepinephrine, together with some of the inflammatory changes, which is, it's important I underscore that Parkinson's is not just a disease of the dopamine system. Those other systems are involved. And those other systems, the extent to which they're involved varies somewhat between Parkinson patients. But my short answer for that question is the depression in Parkinson's is related to the disease process, yes, but not the substantia nigra portion of the disease, but the other portions.
Very nice. Good to know. The second question this person had was, is suicidal ideation normal in advanced cases of PD, and at what frequency should you be concerned?
I'll take the second part first. You should be concerned about suicidal ideation with any frequency. You should be always concerned about suicidal ideation. Now, the first part of the question was, is it normal in the later stages? I'm not exactly sure what normal would be there, but for PD patients that are comorbid with depression, it's pretty common. So the first part is hard to answer, but it depends on how you define normal. But the second part of the question, should you be concerned? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Does brain trauma play a role in making the brain more susceptible to the Parkinson disease trigger?
Yes, absolutely. I could have put that on as well. It's the famous case of Muhammad Ali, but that's a correlational. But there's more cases in that brain trauma, even concussions, closed head injury concussions are correlated with an increased risk of all kinds of neurological symptoms, including seizure and Parkinson's. And part of it, I think, is because that head injury causes some degree of inflammation in the brain.
Okay. This is a very personal question from somebody. My late mother suffered from something known as manic depression back in mid-80s. Unfortunately, she did pass. And now I have the early symptoms of PD at age 68. Could there be any hereditary connection?
Hereditary connection for the PD or the bipolar disorder?
I think for the PD.
Yeah, there is a heredity component. So she said manic depression, which is referred to as bipolar disorder now, which is is swinging between mania and depression. Depression itself does have a genetic component. It's bipolar depression has even a stronger genetic component. So the bipolar can be related. The Parkinson itself, yes, could also be related. But as we mentioned earlier, most cases are not strictly genetic, but there are about 5–10% of cases that are genetic. So the answer is yes, it could be.
Good to know. I think that is all the questions we have for the time being, because I know depression and Parkinson's can sometimes be a very sensitive topic for some people. So if any of you do have any questions that you are not comfortable sharing online, please forward them to me. They will be confidential. And if Dr. Haley is comfortable, I can forward them to him. Would that be okay with you, Dr.
Yes,
Haley?
that's absolutely okay.
Awesome. And I would like everybody at this time being to answer some poll questions before they sign off. But I would like to thank you, Dr. Haley, for taking the time out of your day to really make this webinar happen and present it in a way where we truly can understand what the progression is with Parkinson's and the side effects that come with depression. So thank you so much for letting us understand that topic. And I really do look forward to having you again in the future so that we can learn more about all the exciting studies that are happening at your lab.
Absolutely, and thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right, everybody.